When scientists ran Appalachian DNA against every country in Europe, they were not expecting a mystery. They were expecting confirmation. A quiet British colonial signal, maybe slightly weighted toward Ireland, blending smoothly into the standard American genetic average. What they found instead stopped the analysis cold. The DNA did not point to London. It did not point to Dublin. It pointed to a narrow corridor of land most people have never heard of. A violent border country that shaped one of the most distinctive founding populations in American history. And then, for 250 years, the hollows of Appalachia sealed that population in place. Same valleys, same surnames, same gene pool drifting quietly away from the rest of America while the rest of America moved on. Most people who take a consumer DNA test and see British or Irish staring back at them assume they understand what that means. They picture London. They picture the Irish coast. They do not picture a cattle raid on the Scottish border in 1560. They do not picture a forced resettlement across the Irish Sea, or a ship landing at Philadelphia, or a wagon road pushing south into the mountains. But that is the actual story. And the DNA, when you know how to read it, tells you exactly that. This is what the test does not explain, and this is where the real ancestry begins. The word Appalachia gets used loosely. Politicians use it to mean poverty. Journalists use it to mean a culture. Geographers use it to mean a mountain range. But when geneticists use it, they mean something precise. They mean a specific cluster of counties in eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia, southwestern Virginia, and East Tennessee, where families with 4 or more generations of documented residents in the same county have been living, marrying, and staying put since before the American Revolution. That stability is not an accident. It is the story. When researchers examining Central Appalachian genetic isolation began sequencing individuals drawn from that exact population, they were looking at families who had not drifted to Cincinnati or Detroit during the great migration waves of the 20th century. Families whose roots ran straight down into the same hollow their great-great-grandparents had settled. What the research revealed, without initially anticipating it, was one of the most genetically isolated populations in the entire United States. In genetic terms, the phenomenon is called endogamy. Marrying within a closed community over many generations causes the gene pool to drift. Shared ancestry accumulates. Rare markers become common. The population begins to look less like its neighbors and more like itself. In Appalachia, that drift had been running for roughly 250 years, long enough to produce a genetic signature that stood apart from coastal Virginia, from the deep South, from the upper Midwest, and from every other Anglo-American population. The researchers compared it against. The same surnames kept appearing on the same census rolls across generations. The same families in the same counties. A closed loop, held in place by geography, by culture, and by the mountains themselves. If you have taken a consumer DNA test and your results came back labeled British or Irish, you were not lied to. But you were not told the whole truth either. The reference databases that power tests like 2, 3, and Me and Ancestry DNA work by comparing your DNA against modern population samples grouped into broad regional categories. British and Irish is one category. Germanic Europe is another. The algorithm finds the closest match and assigns a percentage. It is a useful tool, but it was built for breadth, not depth. And in the case of Appalachian ancestry, the depth is exactly where the story lives. When researchers compared the dominant Appalachian markers against modern European reference samples, they were not looking for a country. They were looking for a region. And the closest matches did not land in Dublin or London or Edinburgh. They landed in 3 places that most Americans cannot locate on a map: the Scottish Lowlands along the Anglo-Scottish border, the northern English counties of Cumberland and Northumberland, and a narrow strip of Ulster on the northern coast of Ireland. Those are not the same place. They are not even the same country. but they are genetically continuous with each other in a way that most consumer tests cannot distinguish. The algorithm sees the signal and calls it British. What the signal actually is something older and more specific. A population that formed under extreme pressure along one of the most violent borders in European history was transplanted twice across open water, and then walked itself into the American mountains and stayed there. The reference databases do not yet have a category for Lowland Scots Border English, so the signal gets absorbed into the broader bucket and the specificity disappears. But the specificity is real, and in Appalachia, it is the dominant signal in the entire genome. To understand what the Appalachian signal actually is, you have to go back to a war that most history books skip entirely. Not a war with a clear beginning and a clear end. A war that ran for 300 years along a line drawn between two kingdoms that could never quite agree on where one stopped and the other started. The Anglo-Scottish border, from roughly 1300 to 1600, the country on either side of that line was the most violent region in Western Europe. Not the most violent during wartime, the most violent during peace. Cattle raiding, blood feuds, organized clan warfare, kidnapping for ransom, burning of crops, destruction of livestock. The people who lived there developed their own legal codes, their own loyalties, and their own ruthless logic of survival. They were called the Border Reivers, and the English crown considered them a problem entirely separate from either the Scots or the English. The historian George MacDonald Fraser documented the Reivers surnames in his study of the border country, and that list reads like a roll call of Appalachia today. Armstrong, Graham, Elliot, Bell, Hall, Johnston, Kerr, Maxwell, Nixon, Robson, Scott, Burns. These are not generic British names scattered evenly across the population. These are border names, and they cluster in eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia at rates significantly higher than they appear in the general American population. That is not coincidence. That is a migration trail. The surnames moved because the people moved. And the people moved because 3 centuries of survival on the most dangerous border in Europe had shaped them into something the settled kingdoms around them did not know how to absorb. The Reivers were not outlaws by nature. They were the product of a landscape that rewarded toughness and punished everything else. By the early 1600s, the English crown had run out of patience. The Border Reivers had survived 3 centuries of military campaigns, royal edicts, and forced pacification efforts. They had outlasted every attempt to bring them to heel. So King James I, who was himself a lowland Scot and understood exactly what he was dealing with, chose a different solution. He did not try to civilize the border country. He emptied it. Beginning in 1610, the most troublesome Reiver families were forcibly resettled across the Irish Sea into the Ulster plantation in the north of Ireland. The stated purpose was to populate the province with loyal Protestant settlers. The actual purpose was simpler. The English crown was outsourcing its own border problem. Get the Reivers out of Scotland, plant them in Ireland, and let Ulster absorb the chaos. What happened next is what the geneticists have since been able to confirm in precise detail. The geneticist, Dr. Edmund Gilbert, working out of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, mapped the genetic structure of the Ulster Scots population in 2017. His findings were specific. The Ulster plantation population is not Irish in the Gaelic sense. It is not Scottish in the Highland sense. It is a transplanted Lowland Scots and Border English population, genetically continuous with the people who had lived between Carlisle and Edinburgh before 1610. In other words, the resettlement worked exactly as a genetic transfer. The Reivers brought their DNA with them. They brought their surnames. They brought their culture of kinship, loyalty, suspicion of outside authority, and fierce attachment to their own community. Ulster did not absorb them. They remained themselves, transplanted but intact, waiting for the next pressure that would move them again. It came within a century. The pressure came in waves. Religious persecution under Anglican conformity laws, economic collapse driven by English trade restrictions on Irish wool and linen, A series of failed harvests that left entire communities without enough food to survive the winter. Between 1717 and 1775, roughly 250,000 Ulster Scots left Ireland through the port of Belfast and landed at the port of Philadelphia. The historian James Webb called them the most important and least recorded ethnic group in American history. 250,000 people arriving in a few decades, and almost none of it written down with the care given to other migrations. They did not stay in Pennsylvania. The Quaker establishment that controlled the colony did not want them. They were pushed south and west along the Great Wagon Road, through the Shenandoah Valley into western Virginia and the Carolina backcountry, and finally up into the hollows of southern Appalachia. The road did not lead them there by accident. It led them there because everywhere else along the eastern seaboard, the land was already taken, and the people already there did not want neighbors like them. The hollows suited them. The geography was familiar in the way that hard country is always familiar to people who grew up in hard country. Narrow valleys, steep ridges, thin soil, limited access. Everything that made Appalachia unattractive to coastal planters made it legible to people whose entire cultural inheritance was built around surviving in exactly that kind of terrain. That migration is the single largest source of the modern Appalachian genome. And it is the reason the signal clusters where it does in those three specific places, the Scottish Lowlands, the northern English border counties, and the Ulster coast, rather than anywhere else in the British Isles. Before I show you the last part, if you want to look at your own results and see where Appalachian ancestry fits into your bloodline, I put a full 3-volume PDF bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 23andMe tell you. Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. The Ulster Scots were not the only major population to shape the Appalachian gene pool from the north. Moving down the Great Wagon Road behind them, and in some cases ahead of them, was another founding group that later Americans collapsed into a single misleading label. They called them the Pennsylvania Dutch. The name is a mistranslation. They were not Dutch, they were Deutsch. They were Germans, and like the Ulster Scots, they were not a single undifferentiated population. They came from specific places, under specific pressures, and the DNA reflects that precision. Genetic analysis of Pennsylvania colonial populations has identified 3 distinct subclusters within the German signal. The first and largest is the Rhineland-Palatinate, the region around Mannheim, Heidelberg, and Speyer. This subcluster accounts for roughly 55% of documented Pennsylvania German arrivals between 1683 and 1775. The Palatinate had been the most heavily devastated region of Central Europe during the 30 Years' War and the subsequent wars of Louis XIV. Entire communities had been burned, scattered, and rebuilt within living memory. When the opportunity to leave arrived, they took it. The second subcluster is the Swiss-German cantons, Bern, Zurich, and the Upper Rhine. This is the Anabaptist cluster, the founding population of the Amish and Mennonite communities. The DNA continuity here is the strongest in the entire colonial American genome. An Amish individual tested today against a Bernese Swiss individual tested today will share more recent common ancestry than 2 randomly selected Germans tested in modern Berlin. The third subcluster is the Alsace and Baden region along the Rhine corridor. It is the smallest of the 3 and the most overlooked, partly because much of Alsace later became administratively French, and the descendants gradually stopped identifying as German at all. There is a third stream feeding the Appalachian gene pool, and it is the one that most descendants miss entirely. When geneticists run principal component analysis on the Appalachian samples, a secondary cluster appears that does not match the Scottish border, does not match Ulster, and does not match the Palatinate. It matches the southwestern English counties of Devon, Somerset, Dorset, and Cornwall. This is the signal of the indentured servant migration, and it was already present in the mountains before the Ulster Scots arrived. Between 1607 and roughly 1700, the colonies of Virginia and Maryland absorbed somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 indentured English servants. The majority came from London and the southwestern port cities of Bristol, Plymouth, and Exeter. They crossed the Atlantic under contract, worked off their indentures over 4 to 7 years, and then faced a simple problem. Their contracts were complete, but the tidewater land was already claimed by the planter class that had organized their passage in the first place. They had nowhere obvious to go, so they went west. They moved into the Virginia Piedmont, and from there into the upper south and the eastern edge of Appalachia. By the time the Ulster Scots began arriving in the 1730s and 1740s, the West Country English signal was already embedded in the landscape. The historian David Hackett Fisher, in his 1989 study Albion's Seed, called this the Cavalier and Servant Migration and argued that it produced one of 4 distinct regional American cultures. The genetic evidence has since confirmed what Fisher argued historically. The Southern Appalachian gene pool is roughly a 3-way blend: Lowland Scots and Border English layered through Ulster, English West Country moving up from the Tidewater, and a smaller German and Swiss component bleeding south out of Pennsylvania along the Great Wagon Road. That blend exists nowhere else on Earth in those proportions. Inside the Appalachian signal, there is a smaller marker that punches well above its weight. It does not dominate the genome the way the Ulster Scots component does. It does not carry the demographic heft of the Palatinate German cluster. But it has survived 9 generations of intermarriage with larger surrounding populations without washing out, and that durability alone makes it worth examining carefully. It is the Welsh component, and it is concentrated in eastern Kentucky, southern West Virginia, and the western counties of North Carolina. Welsh DNA is genetically distinct from English DNA and from Scottish DNA in ways that matter to researchers. It is the closest living approximation of the pre-Roman population of Great Britain, the people who were already on the island before the Anglo-Saxon migrations reshaped the lowland genetic landscape. The haplogroup R1b, L21, which we encountered earlier as the Celtic Atlantic signal, reaches its highest European frequency in Wales. Researchers tracking Welsh genetic markers have identified this component running through Appalachian samples at rates small enough to be overlooked but consistent enough to be real. The Welsh migration to colonial America was modest in absolute numbers, perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 arrivals across the entire colonial period. But it was geographically concentrated in ways that left a traceable mark. The Welsh tract in Pennsylvania, Welsh settlements in the Yadkin Valley of North Carolina, a smaller stream that pushed directly into eastern Kentucky in the late 1700s following the same mountain corridors the Ulster Scots had used a generation earlier. If your surname is Davis, Jones, Williams, Evans, Edwards, Lewis, Morgan, or Roberts, and your family papers trace through Kentucky, West Virginia, or western North Carolina, the most likely source region is southern Wales, specifically the counties of Glamorgan and Carmarthen. The Welsh marker stayed in a genome reshaped by centuries of intermarriage. That kind of persistence means something. The most common family story in Appalachia is the Cherokee great-grandmother. Roughly 1 in 3 families across eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, and northern Georgia carry some version of it. The details shift depending on who is telling it. Sometimes she is 2 generations back, sometimes 3. She is almost always female. She is almost always unnamed. And she is almost always placed just beyond the edge of living memory, far enough back to be romantic, close enough to feel real. The geneticists have looked at this carefully, and the answer is precise in a way that family stories rarely are. Genetic studies of Appalachian populations have consistently found that average Native American admixture is very low, often well under 1%. That number includes a small fraction of individuals with verifiable Cherokee ancestry traceable to documented descent lines, mostly concentrated in families connected to the Qualla boundary and the mixed-race communities along the Tennessee and North Carolina line. When you remove those documented cases from the average, the number drops further. The overwhelming majority of Appalachian DNA, when tested, traces back entirely to Europe. That does not make the stories meaningless. The historian Gregory Smithers, in his 2015 work on the Cherokee diaspora, documented how those family narratives often replace something else entirely. A free black ancestor, made inconvenient by the racial codes of the 19th century. A Melungeon ancestor from one of the mixed-race communities that existed in the Virginia and Tennessee mountains. A Romani ancestor. Or simply darker-featured European ancestry from southern Italy or the Iberian Peninsula that became socially difficult to claim after the 18th century hardened its attitudes about who counted as white. The Cherokee great-grandmother was the safer story. It carried a kind of romance without the social cost. The DNA, when you actually run it, mostly tells you something else. Not a mystery, just Europe, arriving from specific places, under specific pressures, for specific reasons. If you have taken a consumer DNA test, and your results came back labeled British, Scottish, or Irish, with a colonial American paper trail running through Appalachia, here is what you are actually looking at. The British label is not telling you that your ancestors walked the streets of London. It is telling you that the algorithm cannot distinguish between Lowland Scots, Border English, Ulster Scots, and West Country English at the resolution most consumer tests currently offer. All four of those populations are real. All four are genetically distinct from each other in ways that matter historically. And all four of them feed the Appalachian genome in different proportions depending on which hollow, which county, and which founding family you trace your line through. Your DNA does not point to Buckingham Palace. It points to Carlisle and Howick, and Coleraine and Plymouth, and Heidelberg, specific places, specific borders, specific pressures that pushed specific people across specific stretches of open water and then down a specific road into the American mountains. The paternal haplogroup evidence sharpens that picture further. If your Y chromosome result came back as R1b, L21, the Celtic Atlantic signal, your direct male line traces through Ireland, Scotland, Wales, or the Western British Fringe, rather than through the Anglo-Saxon lowlands. If it came back as R1b, U106, your father's line traces to the Germanic North Sea coast, entering England most likely with the Anglo-Saxon migrations rather than before them. In central Appalachia, the genetic data shows a measurable skew toward R1b, L21, with a specific subclade appearing at rates significantly above the American baseline. That subclade reaches its highest European frequency in two places, Western Scotland and the Ulster coast of Northern Ireland. The genetic evidence and the surname evidence point to the same origin. The textbook called them Scots-Irish. The DNA is more precise than that. The English crown moved the Reivers to Ulster in 1610. Ulster moved them to Philadelphia between 1717 and 1775. The Great Wagon Road moved them into Appalachia by 1780, and the Hollows held them there for 250 years, marrying within the same valleys, passing the same surnames down the same census rolls, while the gene pool drifted quietly away from the rest of America and kept its shape. That is why the Appalachian DNA signal looks the way it does. Not because the people there are different from other Americans in some mystical or invented sense. Because their founding population was specific, their geography was isolating, and the combination of those two things held the original signal intact long enough for modern science to read it clearly. When researchers ran the comparison and the numbers came back, that is what they were looking at. A 400-year-old border preserved inside a modern American genome. The violence of the Anglo-Scottish border country, the forced resettlement of Ulster, the long walk down the wagon road, all of it compressed into a genetic signature that consumer tests label British and move past without explanation. The DNA does not replace the story. It adds another layer to it. It shows that the roots reach back not to a generic colonial past, but to a specific corridor of land. a specific century of displacement, and a specific set of founding families who walked into the mountains and did not come back out. Borders move, bloodlines do not. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories tracing the real origins behind your DNA results. And tell me in the comments which population should we uncover next. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching this video. Before you go, your raw DNA data has hidden stories waiting to be unlocked. Tap the link in the description to download your ebook copy and find out what they are.